Today in the Daily Dose, political scandals in American history. Not long after the ink had dried on the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the Revolutionary War, political scandals have been part and parcel of the American landscape due to man's ceaseless capacity for greed, corruption, and an insatiable appetite for salacious details by everyday Americans. Accordingly, Daily Dose Documentary takes a look at some of the all-time zingers in American history. In 1791, future President Andrew Jackson eloped with a woman named Rachel Donaldson, who confided in Jackson that she had previously been married to one Louis Robards of Nashville, Tennessee. Believing that Robards had arranged for their divorce after their separation, when Robards charged her with adultery, Jackson would have to wait until 1794 to legally marry her a second time after divorce proceedings had worked their way through the court system. Years later, during the election cycle of 1828, opposing candidate John Quincy Adams exposed Jackson's dirty laundry to the American public, intended to sully Jackson's reputation as a morally upright candidate. And while Jackson won the White House by a wide margin, Jackson blamed Rachel's untimely death 2 months before he took office on the personal attacks aimed at he and his now deceased wife. Known for their robber baron clout on Wall Street and their complete lack of scruples, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, president and vice president respectively of the Erie Railroad, trailed a long list of prior shady deals, including the issuance of fraudulent stocks and bribing public officials and judges, all in an effort to line their pockets with untold riches. Dubbed the Mistopheles of Wall Street for his ability to line his pockets, in early 1869, Gould devised a way to corner the gold market, enlisting Fisk in his scheme, who contributed some $7 million, and Abel Corbin, a former Washington bureaucrat who happened to be married to President Ulysses S. Grant's sister. At the time of their scheme, gold remained the official currency for international trade, while the U.S. itself had gone off the gold standard in lieu of federally backed greenbacks, originally used to fund the Union's Civil War efforts. After Corbin gained assurances from Grant that the nation's leader had changed his mind on selling some of the Treasury's gold to stabilize the Wall Street gold market, Gould and his fellow conspirators began secretly stockpiling gold during the late summer of 1869, driving prices trading on the New York Stock Exchange's gold room from $100 a unit to 141 greenbacks in August alone, trapping speculators and short sellers in a sudden financial vice. By late September, Grant had his wife send a letter to Corbin demanding he cease and desist, while in true robber baron fashion, Gould began selling off his gold at an enormous profit, at the same time concealing his trades from his colluding partners. With gold prices now topping $145 a unit, on September 24, 1869, now known as Black Friday, Grant ordered the Treasury Department to sell $4 million in gold reserves, sending not only gold prices but Wall Street stocks in general into a precipitous downward tailspin, bankrupting or severely damaging many of Wall Street's most venerable investment houses. Thousands of high-rolling Wall Street speculators met with near-instant financial ruin, while foreign trade ceased altogether, further destroying many farmers when wheat and corn prices fell by 50%. Ripples from Black Friday depressed the U.S. economy for several years to come, at the same time casting a blight on the remainder of Grant's tenure as president. Both Gould and Fisk would use their political connections to avoid even a day of jail time, and while exact numbers are hard to come by, Gould's Black Friday profits netted him somewhere in the neighborhood of $12 million, or some $450 million in today's currency, making the gold scandal of 1869 the first Black Friday in American history. In yet another large political and financial scandal for the Grant presidency, in 1872, a newspaper investigation exposed massive corruption and fraud during the construction of the first transcontinental railroad, when Thomas Durant and other corporate officials of the Union Pacific Railroad formed a fictitious shell company called Credit Mobilier of America, which was a construction company that charged the federal government $94 million for work worth $50 million. Most of the excess padded cash was duly shared among company executives, while some was used to bribe important politicians, including then Vice President Schuyler Colfax, Speaker of the House James G. Blaine, and future President James Garfield. And while the scandal destroyed the political careers of a good number of politicians, no criminal charges were ever filed. In the congressional election cycle of 1874, however, 1/3 of all members of Congress were voted out of office. In one of the most significant political corruption cases in U.S. history, the whiskey ring scandal had its early roots shortly after the Civil War, when the federal government imposed high excise taxes on whiskey to help pay down war debts. Exposed by Treasury Secretary Benjamin Bristow in 1875, during Grant's second term in office, his subsequent investigation revealed how government officials were bribed by whiskey distillers, primarily in St. Louis, Chicago, and Milwaukee, in an effort to underreport their whiskey production numbers to reduce the amount of taxes they paid, lining the pockets of primarily Republican politicians at the expense of the American taxpayer. Determined to wipe out corruption, Bristow ordered raids on distilleries and revenue offices, leading to incriminating evidence that millions of dollars have been siphoned off through fraudulent accounting and kickback schemes. Even Grant's personal secretary, Orville Babcock, was accused of protecting members of the whiskey ring. Yet despite mounting evidence against him, Grant remained loyal to Babcock by testifying on his behalf during the subsequent trial. Babcock was eventually acquitted, but the trial and whiskey ring scandal raised serious public concerns about Grant's ability to address corruption within his administration. The whiskey ring scandal led to over 230 indictments with 110 convictions, and while Grant himself was never directly implicated in the scandal, his loyalty to Babcock and his failure to prevent the scandal significantly damaged his legacy, while exposing the widespread nature of corruption during the Gilded Age. The scandal amplified the call for civil service reform, which ultimately led to the passage of the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act in 1883. Dating back to 1860 and persisting into President James Garfield's tragically shortened presidency, the U.S. government employed a system of mail routes known as star routes to deliver mail to remote and rural areas, particularly in the American Midwest and West. Marked by 3 stars to signify special postal services, private companies bid on these contracts, where they received federal reimbursement based on the frequency and difficulty of mail deliveries. The system, however, was highly susceptible to corruption when postal officials, subcontractors, and politicians conspired to rig the bidding process by deliberately submitting a low initial bid to win a contract before using bribery and fraud to secure large increases in payment by claiming that additional services were required to effect delivery, allowing corrupt officials and contractors to pocket millions of dollars of taxpayer money. While Garfield was not directly implicated in the scandal, during his victorious election to the White House in 1880, much of his campaign was run on a promise to clean up corruption in the federal government, obliging him to tackle the Star Root scandal after taking office in 1881. His subsequent investigation exposed several key figures, including former Senator Stephen W. Dorsey of Arkansas and Second Assistant Postmaster General Thomas J. Brady. And while later trials failed to secure any major convictions, Garfield's crackdown on corruption angered many powerful figures who profited from the scheme, leading some historians to believe that his investigation may have played a role in his assassination a mere 6 months into his presidency, when he was assassinated by Charles J. Guiteau, who was associated with the many politicians who benefited from the fraud. Another major political distraction was the "Mama, Where's My Pa" scandal during the presidential election cycle of 1884, when it was revealed by his Republican political opponents that a woman named Maria C. Halpin claimed that presidential candidate Grover Cleveland had seduced and impregnated her a decade earlier, where she gave birth to a child she named Oscar Folsom Cleveland, using the surname of Cleveland's close friend Oscar Folsom. To add to the scandal's intensity, she also claimed that Cleveland had her committed to an insane asylum before paying for young Oscar to be placed in an orphanage, leading to the Republican campaign chant, "Mama, Where's My Pa?" in a clear attempt to attack Cleveland's character and credibility. The chant became one of the most famous campaign slogans in American history, reflecting the intense personal nature of the 1884 election, while the Democrats' response, "Gone to the White House, ha ha ha," became equally famous. Cleveland's Republican opponent, James G. Blaine, hoped the scandal would sway voters against Cleveland, yet the New Yorker, a bachelor at the time of the alleged affair, took full responsibility by paying child support before Halpin's admission to an asylum. Although Cleveland never confirmed that he was the actual father of the child, his supporters argued that Cleveland had accepted paternity since several of his friends, including Oscar Folsom, had been intimate with Halpin, and since he was the only unmarried man among them, his decision was solely designed to protect their reputations and marriages. Cleveland's straightforward response helped him weather the storm, while Blaine's own scandals helped to secure Cleveland's entry into the White House, where he married Oscar Folsom's 21-year-old daughter Frances in 1886, a woman 28 years his junior. During the early 20th century, the federal government retained several oil reserves for use by the U.S. Navy in times of war, including the Teapot Dome Reserve in Wyoming and 2 others in California, Elk Hills and Buena Vista. Managed initially by the Department of the Navy, after President Warren G. Harding took office in 1921, he transferred his jurisdiction to the Department of the Interior, led by Secretary Albert B. Fall, who suspiciously leased the Teapot Dome Reserve to Harry F. Sinclair of the Mammoth Oil Company, while Elk Hills went to Edward L. Doheny, owner of Pan American Petroleum, each lease awarded without the slightest formal process of competitive bidding. For his efforts, Fall received some $400,000 in bribes, or $6.7 million in today's currency. In return, Sinclair and Doheny illegally extracted oil from both federal reserves at highly favorable terms, adding vastly to their fortunes at taxpayer expense. 2 years later, Wisconsin Senator Robert M. La Follette Sr. and others noticed Fall's increasingly lavish lifestyle, leading to a Senate investigation in 1923 led by Montana Senator Thomas J. Walsh, which exposed Fall's crooked deals at Teapot Dome and Elk Hills. The subsequent scandal outraged the American public, leading to widespread distrust of government, and while Harding was never directly implicated in the scandal, Teapot Dome merged with other Harding administration scandals to permanently tarnish his reputation. He passed away from a heart attack while still in office in August of 1923, even before the full extent of the scandal had been exposed. Convicted of accepting bribes in 1929, Fall became the first U.S. cabinet official to be imprisoned for corruption, serving 1 year in prison and fined $100,000, while Sinclair and Doheny managed to escape any significant penalties.
In Boston, Dr. Daniel Ellsberg, the man named as the source of the Pentagon copy that appeared in the New York Times, turned himself in today to federal authorities. David Culhane reports.
Even if the FBI had wanted to arrest him outside the courthouse this morning, they probably couldn't have done it. Ellsberg was walled off by a mob of newsmen and supporters as he admitted that he was indeed the man who brought the Pentagon Papers to the press and congressional leaders.
In the fall of 1969, I took the responsibility on my own initiative of delivering to the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the U.S. Senate the information contained in the so-called Pentagon Papers, including the several studies on negotiations which have not been given to any newspaper. I could only regret that I had not at that same time released that information to the American public through the newspapers.
In a classified study commissioned in 1967 by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, the 7,000-page Pentagon Papers, as they became known, was originally entitled United States-Vietnam Relations, 1945 to 1967. Compiled by military analysts and historians, the Pentagon Papers revealed how multiple U.S. administrations, from Truman to LBJ, misled both Congress and the American people regarding the scope and purpose of American involvement in Southeast Asia. The report proved to be one of the most harmful documents in U.S. history regarding deception by federal officials and outright denial of press freedoms, detailing how the U.S. secretly expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos, while fabricating justifications for escalating U.S. military presence in the region, at the same time exaggerating the justifications for U.S. intervention, following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. Leaked by former Defense Department analyst and military strategist Daniel Ellsberg, who had become disillusioned by the Vietnam War, his photocopied report was delivered to the New York Times in March of 1971.
Hello.
General Haig, sir. Ready.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Al.
Goddamn New York Times expose of the most highly classified documents of the war.
Oh, that. I see. I didn't read the story, but you mean that was leaked out of the Pentagon?
Sir, the whole study that was done for McNamara and then carried on after McNamara left by Clifford and the peaceniks over there. This is a devastating security breach of the greatest magnitude of anything I've ever seen.
Well, what's being done about it then? I mean, I didn't. Did we know this was coming out?
No, we did not, sir.
Yeah.
There are just a few copies of this.
But what about the
volume report?
But what about the? Let me ask you this though. What about Laird? What's he going to do about it? Now I just start right at the top and fire some people.
Fearing the leak would damage national security while setting a precedent for future whistleblowers, the Nixon administration sought a court injunction to halt further publication, which escalated to the Supreme Court in a case entitled New York Times Company v. United States, who ruled in favor of the press in June of that same year. Ellsberg was tried under the Espionage Act of 1917. However, his case was dismissed in 1973 after it was revealed that White House officials known as the Plumbers had illegally broken into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in search of damaging information. In 1972, when Richard Milhous Nixon began campaigning for a second term in office, Americans were politically divided over the Vietnam War, leading Nixon's advisors to employ aggressive and quite illegal campaigning techniques, which saw members of Nixon's Committee to Re-elect the President, known derisively as CREEP, to break into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C., bugging phones and copying top-secret documents in an effort to gain an upper hand on their political rivals. When the wiretaps began to fail, however, on June 17th of that same year, 5 burglars were caught red-handed as they prepared for a second break-in, leading detectives to find evidence on the men, including a phone number at the White House. Over the next 2 years, the truth would be revealed through the efforts of a Senate investigating committee led by trial judge John Sirica and an independent special prosecutor named Archibald Cox, along with 2 investigative reporters from the Washington Post named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Aided by an anonymous whistleblower codenamed Deep Throat, later revealed in 2005 to be Mark Felt, a former associate director at the FBI, Woodward and Bernstein exposed hush money payments to 7 burglars linked directly to the White House, as well as Nixon's push to have the CIA impede investigative efforts by the FBI. When White House counsel John Dean testified before the Senate's investigative committee about Nixon's insistence on taping all conversations to and from the Oval Office, lawmakers began a full-court press demanding that Nixon hand over all tapes in question. In what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, when Cox refused to back down on his demands, on October 20th, 1973, Nixon ordered his firing, which in turn led several Justice Department officials to resign in protest. Matters worsened in March the following year, when a special grand jury indicted 7 former aides to the president, followed by a July order by the Supreme Court demanding that Nixon hand over all his tapes. And when Nixon dragged his feet on the matter, the House Judiciary Committee voted to impeach the president on charges of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, as well as criminal violations to the Constitution. Cornered and out of options, Nixon released the tapes on August 5, 1974, which exposed irrefutable evidence of his complicity. 3 days later, Nixon would become the first sitting American president to resign from office.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
The Cold War-era Iran-Contra Affair became headline news in 1986 after a Beirut newspaper first reported on an arms deal between the United States and Iran, despite U.S. sanctions dating back to the Iran hostage crisis under the thinly veiled objective of buying the release of 7 hostages held by Iranian-backed terrorists in Lebanon. In an effort to skirt legislation passed by Democrats known as the Boland Amendment, which restricted the CIA and the Department of Defense from engaging in foreign conflicts, Reagan gave tacit approval to National Security Council head Robert McFarlane and staffer Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who devised a scheme to finance the Contras, a group of drug-dealing guerrillas fighting the Marxist government of Nicaragua, by overcharging Iran for weapons, in turn siphoning off the profits to the Contras. Navy Vice Admiral John Poindexter, the President's national security advisor, testified before Congress that he had kept details of the covert operation from the President and his advisors, including Secretary of State George Shultz and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. After a joint congressional investigative committee began probing the Iran-Contra deal, along with a Reagan-appointed independent investigative group known as the Tower Committee, the politically divided House and Senate were troubled to find that a major policy initiative was carried out by private businessmen, yet run by National Security Council staff. When the Congressional Committee's final report was issued in late 1987, The report ruled that the ultimate responsibility for the events in the Iran-Contra Affair rested solely on the president. And while the president may not have known what his national security advisors were doing, he should have. While the American press hounded Reagan over the matter for the rest of his presidency, by the end of his second term, only one private contractor, Thomas Kleins, actually served time for his part in the Iran-Contra Affair. And while Reagan himself acknowledged under oath that the entire affair was a mistake, his many supporters ultimately shelved the Iran-Contra Affair to a largely overlooked place in American history, helping to build on Reagan's lasting moniker as the Teflon president. In an affair that took place from 1995 to 1997 between President Bill Clinton and White House intern Monica Lewinsky, when their affair was exposed in 1998, after Lewinsky's confidant Linda Tripp revealed recordings with Lewinsky, the president initially tried to lie his way out of a tough situation.
Now, I have to go back to work on my State of the Union speech, and I worked on it till pretty late last night. But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
In the months that followed, DNA evidence on Lewinsky's now infamous blue dress contradicted his denial.
Indeed, I did have a relationship with Miss Lewinsky that was not appropriate. In fact, it was wrong. It constituted a critical lapse in judgment and a personal failure on my part for which I am solely and completely responsible. I misled people, including even my wife. I deeply regret that.
The scandal would result in Clinton's impeachment by the House of Representatives in December of 1998 on perjury and obstruction of justice charges, only to be acquitted by the Senate in 1999, which allowed him to complete his presidency despite the damage he had caused to his presidential credibility, his marriage to Hillary Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, at the same time forever casting doubt on the truthfulness of future sitting presidents. Donald Trump holds the unprecedented distinction of receiving 2 House impeachment votes for misconduct in office. The first was in December of 2019, when the House approved 2 articles of impeachment for abuse of power and obstruction of justice after a whistleblower accused Trump of withholding financial aid unless Ukrainian officials provided political dirt against presidential candidate Joe Biden.
Now it is up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here, we're going to walk down to the Capitol. And we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
While he was acquitted of his first impeachment in February of 2020, a second impeachment landed in January of 2021, when he was formally sanctioned for inciting insurrection preceding a right-wing extremist attack on the U.S. Capitol, making political scandals in America an ongoing pushback against corruption, greed, and political obfuscation. And there you have it, political scandals in American history, today on the Daily Dose. Today's Daily Dose documentary is brought to you by PlatoSpeech.com, a lesson planning tool leveraging content like this and much more for educators and homeschooling parents. Check out the description for more information so that you too can teach something new every day.